these days? How you doing with making sense of your life, your story, this time, your world? How do you make sense of it all? Y'all remember Mad Libs? Those fill-in-the-blank books that we used to get in grade school? Started in 1953. Two men named Leonard Stern and Roger Price were writing for a sitcom. Some of you are old enough to remember the Honeymooners. They were working as writers on this show, and Stern got writer's block. He was trying to come up with the word to describe somebody's nose, and he couldn't come up with it. So without letting Price know the blank he was trying to fill in, he asked for an adjective. Price said, cluttered. And once Stern described somebody as having a cluttered nose, they broke out laughing hysterically. Realizing that when you fill in the blank with the right part of speech, but in the wrong context, you get something absolutely absurd. That's how it all began. And over 70 years later, 110 million of 200 varied copies, editions of these Mad Libs have been sold worldwide. The madness and the Mad Lib comes from the fact that the person filling in the blank is blind to the story. And I like to suggest we find ourselves doing that a lot these days. Trying to make life make sense by filling in the blanks and missing pieces without really knowing the entirety of the story. And what we come out with turns out to be quite silly sometimes, right? We find ourselves struggling to put the pieces into a meaningful, coherent whole, leaving people with a sense of disjointedness, disappointment, and walking away with a profound sense of incompleteness. But the good news of the morning is this: ours is a whole-making God who fills in all of our blanks in order to make it all make sense. As a whole-making God. The Shema, that Deuteronomy 6 prayer that Jewish people have been praying together for thousands of years every day, starts like this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And that oneness isn't just that there's only one God, it's a description of our God, who is completely whole, not missing any piece. The Lord, our God, is one. And God is actively working in your life to give you that same wholeness today. Ours is a whole-making God. The axle on which the whole of the Sermon on the Mount revolves is Jesus' command to be perfect as your God is perfect. And this is not a command to never mess up. It's an invitation to being made whole and complete, just like your God. Matter of fact, Jesus' last words on the cross, "It is finished." These aren't words of resignation. These are a declaration that Jesus has finished doing everything he needs to do to set in motion a process where all of humanity can be made whole. Ours is a whole-making God, with the ability to integrate the fragmented, disjointed, and disparate experiences of our lives into a meaningful, coherent whole. Ours is a whole-making God. And to prove it, Jesus rose from the dead. The author and finisher of our faith lives. And because he lives, we have access to Jesus' power, Jesus' presence, and all of Jesus' promises. This is what we're exploring in this Eastertide season. A season where we get a chance to really dig deep in this phenomenon of Jesus' resurrection, which stands at the center of our faith and is the guiding metaphor for our lives. And this morning's text draws our attention to this. Because he lives, our unfinished story is completed. No gaps, no blanks, no missing pieces. We find this in Luke 24, 13 through 35. I'll read it for you again. It's a little long, but it's just so rich. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all the things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you're walking along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find the body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all Scripture. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the Scripture to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he's appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. What do we do? That's the question the crowd asked the Apostle Peter in Acts chapter 2 when confronted with the facts of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. What do we do? It's the same question facing the two disciples of Jesus here in Luke 24. What do we do? Having spent 3 years watching the miraculous, witnessing Jesus' wisdom, and experiencing earthquakes and the sky being darkened in the middle of the day, as the one they hung all their hopes on is hanging on the cross. What do you do to make that make sense? What do you do? Well, these two disciples decided to walk away with an unfinished story. They decided to pack it all up and just go home. Seems as if they were done. But as they walked, they find themselves processing things, trying to fill in the blanks of all that had happened. And much like God does for us, Jesus met them in their processing. And much like us, these disciples don't recognize divine encounter when it happens. Jesus shows up, he walks right with them when they do not recognize him. Yeah, we aren't told why they don't recognize him. Could be their grief that blind them to recognizing Jesus. Could have been their disappointment or their doubts. The verb structure here suggests it may be God holding off their recognition of Jesus until just the right time for it to be revealed. But Jesus meets them in their processing and in love assists them in that process. Jesus stops them in their tracks with a key processing question: what are you discussing on the way? Basically asking, what have you been spending your time talking about? Maybe that's a good question for us to ask ourselves as we think about the last few weeks. What have you been discussing most of your time? How have you been discussing it? Jesus stops them and invites them into a time of self-reflection. And in divine irony, Luke has the disciple ask the person everything is centered around, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have been taking place there in these days?" Not only is Jesus not a stranger to these events, but he is the center of these events. Jesus knows the what, why, when, and how of every minute of these last few days. See, Jesus has the complete story. So Jesus, with great patience and great love, continues to help them process their stuff. So he asks, what things? Giving them space to sift through all the facts to get to the heart of the issue. And they do have a few facts: who Jesus is, what took place, the women's report of the resurrection. But as they share the few facts that they do know, all of a sudden they get to the issue of their hearts. They confess that because things didn't go the way they expected it, they lost heart. They lost hope. You see that in verse 21? But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Because things didn't go the way they expected, they gave up hope. They stopped living with expectancy. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. All those hopes of freedom and unity, living in a place of thriving, all their debt forgiven and their physical and spiritual poverty relieved that Israel was looking for thousands of years. Because things didn't work out the way they thought they were, they just gave up expecting that it would actually happen. That's something we would do well to think through ourselves, right? How hard are we holding on to hope these days? To what degree are you living with expectancy that God will make a way? Question I'm always asking myself: is my hope a past tense hope or a present hope in what God is doing in the world? We got to ask ourselves these questions, and regardless of what your answer is, no judgment. It's just good to really know, because look how Jesus responds to them when their hearts were revealed to them. Jesus fills in the missing pieces. In some way, Jesus tells them and reminds us, hasn't that always been part of the story? God doing things in ways we would never suspect? In verses 26 through 27, Jesus says, was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter his glory? Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all Scripture. Jesus fills in the blanks. Moses' suffering that leads to Israel's freedom. Just like Jesus frees us, the suffering of wilderness wandering leads Israel to a place of thriving. Just like Jesus' suffering suffered to find a home for us. The suffering of the Old Testament exile leads to physical and spiritual return to God. Just like Jesus' suffering brings us back to God. We miss this part in the entirety of the story because we have been convinced that suffering is a failure when it's merely a feature. a feature that breaks God's heart every time we experience hardship, but a feature God can use to make you whole. In the very moment these disciples invite Jesus into intimate spaces of their life, the very moment Jesus becomes the host of their table and blesses and breaks the bread, God reveals. The rumors are true. Jesus Christ is alive. To celebrate communion with each other and with God every Sunday as we do reveals the core truth of who Jesus is and what life is all about. It is in the breaking and the pouring out for others that we are made whole and where we find new life. And it's in that moment, and upon returning to their community, that these disciples were made whole and their unfinished story completed. What do? There are a number of things we find these disciples doing in the text that we can do as well to participate in God's whole making process. First, be willing to walk with each other and with God. May we be willing to process our emptiness and misunderstandings with each other and with our God. Second, be willing to stop for times of self-reflection. In verse 17, it says that when they encountered Jesus, they stood still, which led them to a time of self-reflection. May we take the same time for ourselves. Next, these two disciples' stories were made whole because they had a teachable spirit. Their hearts burned as Jesus taught them. And may our hearts do the same as we commit to study the ways and teachings of Jesus. And let's always make space in our lives to celebrate communion with each other and with Christ. And just like in the text, may Jesus always be revealed as not only the host, but the meal itself. God is inviting all of us into a universal story that brings order and meaning to the fragmentation of our life story. It's a story of Jesus' life, death, burial, and resurrection. And to live this faith with a present hope is to find that our story is caught up in Jesus' story. And Jesus' story is caught up in the Old Testament Israel story. And that story is caught up in God's own story. A story with no gaps, no blanks, and not one missing piece. And it is there that God makes it all make sense and where we are made whole. And where, just like Jesus, we too get a chance to walk out of our life's tombs alive. Hope that made sense.
Morning, everyone. It's